All right, thank you. With that said, I'd like to welcome Prime Minister to the debate participant here.
Hi. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, both here.
Okay, cool. Let me just set my timer. And drink some water. Okay lang. It keeps spilling on me.
Sorry.
Sorry. No, that's not your fault.
Sorry, my joke
Then-
is like that.
Then I can't drink properly. Okay. POIs through voice. I can't see chat. Would love to take POIs from closing. We live in a society that puts a premium on love. We tell you that this premium has been pernicious, and this narrative is the main reason why that premium hurts people. The stance coming from opening government is clear. We regret the premium it put on love, and instead what we support is the lack of a premium on romantic love, and that is more towards trying to make sure that we open up options towards finding meaning, like for example in terms of friendship or perhaps your own sanity and loneliness could be something that you could say that is a source of loneliness. What does the narrative look like under in this debate, and how does it pervade general society? There are four ways. Number one, it views relationships as a net good, which means that regardless of whether they are good or bad people, the fact that you are in a relationship means that you are in a better situation rather than being lonely, and it frames the loneliness as something that is inherently harmful because this is a point at which you have never loved at all, and that is the worst case in this narrative. The second thing is that it's okay to be risky, to take that leap of faith, to ask out your crush, to be in a relationship even though you're unsure, which means that you are significantly putting yourself in a significant amount of risk, and that is bad. Number three, it is that whenever you are in a relationship, you are more likely to see out the relationship to its end rather than immediately ending it to the point at which you say that this is not worth it anymore. Meaning that under their paradigm, when you believe this narrative, that is where you're more likely to stay with your abusive boyfriend rather than to leave immediately, because it's better to have love than to never have loved at all. The final thing is that the harm here is like you will inevitably find love under their side, which means that you just need to keep trying and trying, even if you have a high turnover rate, even if you have situationships, regardless, as long as you find love, right? First argument. Why do we think this harms people who had bad relationships, which we think is the most vulnerable? Realistically, this is an important argument because the motion and the narrative exists or only affects people who have been hurt by love. Like they have been abandoned, they have been left, and these are people who have been hurt by their previous love. Obviously, people who are happy in their relationships don't say this narrative because they are happy in love, which means that this doesn't activate in that particular paradigm, so they are immediately out of the debate. The problem on the opposition side is that these people who are already vulnerable because they have been hurt by other people, perhaps they have been abandoned or perhaps they've been abused, means that these people tolerate the bad relationships that they go into and say that it is okay, they say that it is worth it because it is for the plot. The reasons why this is true under their paradigm and why it is harmful is because of two things. Number one, this narrative comes when you are separated coming from other people. You use it as a justification that it's not as bad to be abused, it's not as bad to be abandoned, which means that under their paradigm, people who, for example, go into situationships, go into even more situationships, that is a life that has more uncertainty and a life that has more pain because you're always in that limbo of whether or not you're going to be happy in that relationship. That means under opposition side, you are okay with your abusive and exploitative boyfriend using you for money because it's better to say that you have been loved because you got love bombed than to have never loved at all. I'll take the PY.
Yeah, I don't see why this narrative only applies to people who've been in love and are going to be hurt. Why doesn't it also apply to people who are considering trying out for love and
Oh
are
yeah,
worried?
sure. That also considered. I'll put that in my second argument. But the second reason is because under their paradigm, under opposition, it is a worse life to be one where you are lonely with no romantic love. That means that they frame this loneliness as the absolute evil. We tell you under our side that that means that you have significantly less choices because you think that being alone is no longer okay. Being with your friends only and being clingy to your friends is a bad thing because it frames the loneliness that you experience as evil and inherently something that makes your life bland and meaningless. What is the solution and why is this significantly better under opening government? Because absent this narrative, you have significantly more choice for two reasons. Number one, it removes the shame of not being in a relationship. Now, people who have been abandoned can choose to just be lonely and to be single for a while because under our paradigm that is significantly better because you do not have to subject yourselves to the harms and uncertainties of going into the next relationship, which might be hedonistic and which might cause you even more harms to yourself in terms of the economic like trade-offs that you have to make and the mental trade-offs that you have to make because love is inherently an irrational thing that makes you spend a lot and do stupid things. But number two, for the vast majority who cannot access romance, this allows us in general society and this response to the POI, if people want to vie for a relationship, we tell you that it's okay if you do not get into a relationship. Sometimes people can't because they are too ugly, because they are unlovable. We allow them the capacity to find meaning and to be validated because at the very least, meaning making is not no longer only existent when you find love. So for these two spectrums of people who have been hurt, now we give them a choice to stay single, to self-preserve themselves, which is more certain as a benefit. But secondly, for the vast majority of people who cannot access romance, we benefit as well. We benefit them as well for the simple reason that now their option is to find happiness is no longer just find love and then make mistakes, but now is to preserve yourself as well, perhaps find your hobbies or spend time with your friends. This is something opposition cannot trade off because obviously there. Oh yeah. So the second argument, why we think that society is less rational and this is a bar to joy when the narrative exists. The problem in status quo is that love is the only path to happiness under their paradigm. Opposition will say, oh, but there are a lot of countervailing narratives like friendships and self-care. But obviously this does not exist because the premium towards finding love or towards having to love is that you need to be in a relationship in the first place and all of the mistakes must be justified. And that the harm inherently is being single. So even if we don't change the world, what we do want is to increase the capacity for us to be able to hold bad people in relationships accountable and to give more capacity for people to be reasonable. Because if it is true, and this is our worst case, that on opposition side, love is a good source of meaning, then even if that's true, we'll buy it. Why is it significantly better under our side? Number one is because under their side, the narratives say it's okay to be foolish. But the harm with it is that being foolish causes a lot of irreversible harms like trauma that you cannot unremember because it already happened to you. That means that you're significantly less likely to be able to opt in into future relationships in a meaningful manner because you're already traumatized by the last relationships, which means that this is a irreversible harm under their side that you cannot afford to make a mistake in. But secondly, just the victim blaming that occurs here, the fact that it's okay to have love or to never to love and make mistakes and then to never have loved at all, blames the victims for their actions. Why is it significantly better under our side? At the very least, when there is no premium and no glorification, this is not an overriding meaning-making thing, which means that you are far more likely to be reasonable because you don't think there is an urgency for you to find love, and therefore you are more likely to take your time. You are more likely to feel like you can consult other people or to reject other people if you don't think that this love is worth it. But the second thing is that you hold people accountable for the bad things that they have done to you in the past, which means that people are less likely to repeat those mistakes over and over again and justify it by saying that it's okay because at least I was in a relationship. For all of those reasons, we tell you that romance must not override our lives. Sometimes it is the silence in our rooms that give us meaning. Sometimes it is our friends, and we need to open up that narrative because otherwise, in any other society, it wouldn't have happened. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Professor, for the fine speech. I'd like to invite leader of opposition.
Hello.
Okay, yeah. Am I audible and visible?
Yep, both clear.
Okay, perfect. Okay. POIs through chat, please. Let me just pull it up. Okay, perfect. What is love? And we agree with opening government. It can be that tingle you feel when he holds your hand for the first time or when you've had your first kiss. But what we'd like to point out is it can also be your mom holding you after your dad has left. It can also be that feeling of catharsis when you get past the last defender and actually make a goal. And all of these things suggest that this debate is not just about whether or not people will opt into relationships romantically, but rather how do people deal with losing the things that they love, whether it be someone they want to romantically be linked with, whether it be a parent who has died, or anything they feel and attach meaning towards. I want to be clear. This debate is not about relationships that people opt in and out of. It's like the question of instances in which you have no choice but to let go. Where can you find meaning in that loss? And we would suggest it only exists in a world in which this narrative encourages you to find meaning in the times in which you inevitably lose things. We would suggest it looks like movies that often deal with post breakups, etc., that allow for people to see what it looks like to find meaning post breakup. But second, it also looks like cultures that value love even at the cost of some pain and some loss, because they recognize the meaning and, more importantly, the lessons you can get from it. But who does this therefore apply to? So obviously it's anyone who has loved and lost, whether it be relationships, familial bonds, or applies to anyone who has ever felt something that they loved so dearly. And so what does this therefore tell you or tell these people? One, that choosing to love something even at the risk of loss is worth it. Two, that never loving at all is something that is a worse fate. Three, that there's clear emphasis on what is loved as opposed to what is lost. But third, comfort in knowing that that time, that effort isn't something that is wasted, but instead something you can make meaning out of. I want to first frame out abuse and opt out that they tried to explain in opening government. One, when you enter into a relationship, the vast majority of people do not actually believe it will end. And we can see this in the times in which they show these people oftentimes to their family and friends. They oftentimes make long-term commitments or long-term plans and give up large amounts of time to be with this individual. And what this therefore means is the rose-colored glasses through which people opt into relationships will always exist insofar as they do not believe that loss is going to be a reality. And in fact, there are many other narratives that encourage you to do this. For example, Disney princess narratives that have nothing to do with loss that still encourage you to find your Prince Charming, which all will still exist in their world insofar as they can only regret this one singular narrative. So if you want people to be wary about love, there are many other narratives you can deal with. There are many other ways to attack this. But uniquely, it is only this narrative that allows you to be able to process things like loss and therefore find meaning in times in which you cannot avoid it. So the true difference isn't whether or not you opt into the right relationships, but rather what people feel as if it was fine that they spent their time and effort in things that they could not help but lose. First argument then, why this narrative is important in making people feel like they can move on. First level, we would suggest that it espouses loss as a valuable part of love and life. Because note that everyone experiences some kind of loss. And the problem with their world and the reason why people feel extreme pain and an inability to move on is because they do not prime themselves to believe that loss is a thing that is acceptable. And what we do in our world there, with the narrative being strong and prevalent as is probably the case in either world. It is on our world that you are able to get people who are willing to accept loss as something that can happen, but more importantly, recognize that it can be valuable. So the meaning making at the end of it, the question of whether or not you can become a better person or find a better partner, only happens insofar as you believe that what you have lost was valuable in the first place. But second, people around you who also consume this narrative because it's probably like a world or society can help you process the experience. Like, what do you do when your dad dies? Are you able to like find and appreciate the memories you've had with him as opposed to rejecting that feeling in the first place? Because if you believe that you ought to reject things that will end up hurting you and losing you, you make life far less meaningful. So if you take OG to their largest extent, life is meaningless in their world. It is on our world where you allow yourself to experience love, even in times where it's inevitably lost, and therefore you were able to process this. Because what happens in their world absent this narrative? People, therefore, consume in Gov's world their best case of you shouldn't love in this time and you should not opt into these things. And what this therefore means is for people who will inevitably experience loss because they believed in something that may not have come to fruition or their dad dies, that is where you have people who are far less willing to say that it's okay. It's fine that you have lost this person and to believe that you should not have opted into this relationship in the first place. They are far less likely to want to listen to you being a talking about your experiences, or questioning whether or not the choice was right. And what this therefore means is, in their world, that is the point in which you have far less supportive systems because they assign the blame to you insofar as it is your problem for opting into this when we told you not to do so. But third, we would suggest that the motivation to move on begins with the having hope to hold on to, because oftentimes it is at the point of loss that you have very large paradigm shifts for individuals. And what this looks like, for example, is your dad dying. What this looks like, for example, is a life partner you've built your entire preferences and living situation around being gone. And what all of this therefore means is for you to feel as if there is hope, you have to believe that there is meaning in the things that you have sacrificed. Otherwise, you are unlikely to want to reinvest that time or rebuild in something that you are now afraid of losing. It is on our world where you are primed to believe that something is good, or insofar as you believe that something is worth moving on from and learning from. Before I go on, I'll take CG.
So how is this narrative against grief propagated, and what is the proportion of its usage against like romantic relationships?
So I would suggest everything I explained in setup still stands. That's how it's given, movies, culture. But on the second thing, what I would like to point out is that oftentimes this comes in the form of like everything, right? Like when your dad dies, that's what people tell you. It just applies to both quite equally. We would suggest because love and loss are things that oftentimes are together and people all experience. So I want to situate this with their explanation of fear of being alone. It is actually enhanced when there's fear of experiencing that loss because people aren't telling you it's okay to experience that. You assign that blame to them and therefore you isolate these individuals further. Finally then, why do people develop into better people or end up in better relationships in the future? I think it's quite important to note that the inflection point in which you care about this narrative the most is the point in which loss has materialized, and therefore that is what is most proximate to you as opposed to rose-colored tinted glasses. What this therefore suggests is life is what you make of it, and what this therefore means is your ability to relies on you being able to question which points of this relationship or experience was something that was rejected entirely. You are therefore less willing to allow these experiences to inform you for your future decisions. So for all these reasons, oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for the fine speech. I invite TPM.
Okay. Hello, I'll just turn on my camera. Okay. Sorry, did I drop something? POI's through voice. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Loss is a natural feeling. That means that the necessity of the argument coming from OO is unclear. Because if the narrative suggests that, oh, well, this means that you create meaning out of loss, and this narrative is the sole reason for that, I don't really understand when you listen to their analysis very clearly. They use demonstrations like your dad or your mom dying, but this narrative will obviously not affect good relationships that will automatically give you meaning when the loss happens. We think that the narrative is specifically used in the instance where you are unclear or where you have a dilemma if whether the relationship in and of itself does fulfill you or have meaning. That is the reason why these narratives are given to you by society, or the reason why people tell you that it's better to have loved than not have loved at all, because it means that you had an internal dilemma already of whether or not this relationship on net was good for you. So that means that there are literal existing relationships that they have to concede to that this will probably be affected by, which is there are instances where these people have hurt you in the past and they have like existing wrongdoings against you, but is that idea or that notion of love going to override or overtake all of these types of pains or these heartbreaks? That is the specific frame that they had to engage with. They cannot just assert that this is something about like people, like families or like platonic relationships that will obviously still be good, but either side will have these relationships. They have to prove in the most vulnerable of instances where this can apply, why is it still better off in their case. 2 issues for you today. Firstly, we'll clarify who does it affect. We're going to engage on a spectrum. But 2, why exactly we're the only side of where better relationships actually accrue. So the first thing that I want to talk about is who does it actually affect? And we posited to you that it's about relationships that have ended. We think that this is the more likely instance for 3 reasons. 1, if it implies loss, you can intuitively believe that breakups happen more than things like fallout of friendships or familial fallouts. So that means that obviously everyone has families. It's just less likely for you to happen to have like separation of like your parents or just disownment of siblings or even just friendship breakups compared to the amount of people that break up with relationships like boyfriends and girlfriends. That means that the ability for you to use this narrative in romantic instances is a lot larger on scale. Second, that love is specifically associated more with romance. So intuitively, when you use this quote, oftentimes it's about your romantic relationships or romantic experiences. It's still a lot more in terms of the magnitude of how you experience breakups and heartbreak in terms of love. But the last thing is, because this is a coping mechanism of the pain that exists on both sides, we argue to you that because this loss happens more frequently with love, that means that the instances or the demonstrations that we have to engage with majority of times should be in regards to heartbreak. And we characterize very specifically what these look like. But notice that even in the reframe of LO, all of our analysis still applies, that your parental trauma is still likely to be justified. Your friend's toxicity will still be excused because society deems the notion of the relationship having loved to have loved already is something that's worth all of the pain and heartbreak compared to just having a better relationship with yourself or just having that time and energy not be wasted over something as menial as, for example, a toxic relationship. We think that all of these harms still exist because they don't actually engage with our frame as to which the spectrum lies upon. So we prove to you that because in majority of instances, these are the things that are likely to be affected by the emotion because they give no direct engagement. A lot of our arguments coming from Haduca still stands. But the second thing that I want to talk about is how relationships are actually entered, because they also don't prove why exactly this is not something that occurs under their side. The majority of the time, because the premium of love exists, regardless of the Disney princess narrative that they give, this is still likely to be a very dominant and pervasive narrative. Because if they want to necessarily prove that their benefit is actually large or actually worse in this debate, they have to concede to the fact that this narrative will also be very dominant. So it means that if they want to like make a trade-off, they have to ensure that, well, they're gonna take the idea that this is going to be a very powerful narrative, or else their benefit of like having loss be meaningful is also very minimal on their side. That means that how we are able to characterize and argue to you why people are likely to be irrational when they enter these relationships are still true coming from OG. And there was really no response coming from LO when we told you that this over glorification, or the idea that you put a premium on love in it of itself because they see to it as an end goal and as an expectation that will be worth it, regardless of what the outcome of the relationship is still something that will make you hasty. Is still something that we will likely be blindsided by, and there are no incentives coming from opposition why these safety nets are enough to be able to counter or combat these types of incentives that exist in status quo. So therefore, a lot of these things are still likely to be exacerbated on their side. So even if abuse is going to be existent on both, that's still likely to be even worse under theirs. Ashar PR.
Yeah, but people will be hasty in either world. We explain that frame, but people are primed to accept loss when it happens on our world, and that's the clear difference.
Yeah, so it's about extents. I just explained to you that the extent of you having a lot of these abusive relationships be justified and excused are worse under your side. But even to that extent, we still talk to you about why loss is inexclusive. Because if the relationship in and of itself gave you value when it existed, you're still likely to value it after the loss happened. So it's unclear why exactly the delta is, it becomes more meaningful to me at the point at which the loss occurred. Because this dilemma only really happens when there is pain that is existent within the relationship. So we argue to you that you're more likely to be foreseeable, you're likely to have more foresight into how the relationship actually occurred, and you're more realistic on how you actually perceive the relationship in the past when you don't put a premium on the idea that love in and of itself is something to be likely glorified or something that's likely to be a net good, compared to our world where we're going to see it on an objective perspective that there are pros and cons to the relationship that happened. Maybe it could have been better off that I was lonely, or maybe it could have been better off that I entered into that relationship, irregardless of the good things that happened. We think that therefore it's also a better coping mechanism on net, because it means that if you look at your relationship in the past objectively, that probably means that you're not going to be as hurt, or you're not going to personalize the idea of these types of love or what could have been or these what ifs at the point at which the loss happened. So we think that as well, for the individual, it's better for them to be able to prepare themselves or also foresee into the future when they do enter these relationships. It's more likely to be quality. It's more likely to be about self-development. It's more likely to be things that you're likely to actually care about because you prepare for these types of things. You actually care about whether or not this is something that will benefit you in the long run. So the paperweight here is simple. OG wins this debate for two simple reasons. One, we give you the most important thing on an individual level. That these people, that this urgency on this scale is clear because the vulnerability of those who are hurt from relationships are more likely to be the ones that are going to be like exacerbated in terms of the harms that exist on both sides. But the second thing is, anything that closing says, we gave you the prerequisite analysis to any impact. When they have to prove that better relationships exist or that better self-development exists, you have to believe our analysis first. All of these reasons were.
Thank you, DPM, for the fine speech. Now invite for the leader of the opposition.
Hello. Am I seen and heard?
Vote clear.
Three, two, one. So the first thing I want to note is that opening and closing government cannot dictate where these narratives can exist. Because if it is true that this operates most in instances where relationships newly end, i.e., where you're feeling the most emotional with regards to whether or not you regret this relationship or
So sorry, so sorry for
not,
cutting you
then
off.
obviously that still applies. Hello, yeah?
I think you're
What's
quite
up?
laggy.
I'm laggy.
Yeah.
Can I just connect to you first?
Wait, is it connected to mine now or no?
Nope.
Ah, okay. Wait, because my Wi-Fi is also slow. Pero try lang.
Oh, sorry. The Wi-Fi in my house is like dead. And so we're using a really, really unstable pocket Wi-Fi.
Wait, try mine now.
What's the password?
Or you can try turning your video. That might.
Yeah, it also might work.
Can I be heard?
It's clear now.
Is it good now?
Yep.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I want to note is that opening and closing government cannot dictate where these narratives exist if they can still fit within the same piece of framing they say. They say this operates most in instances where relationships are newly fallen. That is to say, when a relationship ends and therefore you are assessing whether or not it would have been better to have not entered into that relationship at all, or whether it was worth it because it is lost. That is to say that all of the analysis that we give still exists to this extent. The response was to say, well, no, in the vast majority of instances, this isn't weaponized against you. But note, narratives aren't necessarily weaponized in the vast majority of instances. They're invisible. They condition the very way in which individuals think. That is to say that if I do truly believe that it would have been better to have not loved at all, or if I do believe that it was worth it to love at the cost of potentially losing that person, it's necessarily the fact that the visceral feeling of pain that I'm feeling as a result of being so attached to this person who just died, the visceral feeling of being attached to somebody who you just left, or something that is only validated coming from opening opposition side. That is to say that they can't just ignore the vast majority of our material by saying that oftentimes it's exclusive, because as much as you try, these narratives and the way in which you feel about these things cannot be fixed. That is to say that we are still winning on the basis of the largest majority of things, because not everybody enters into relationships. Sorry, it said my internet connection is unstable.
It's clear on my end.
Judge. Hello. Okay. Maybe I'll just turn off my camera
Yep.
because I think I was choppy. Yeah. So how much time did I have left?
In my end, still 1:30.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Okay. Restarting my speech. Starting from there. Starting in 3, 2, 1. So all of the things we say about ensuring that individuals have a right to be able to feel as if and develop and process their emotions in ways that are better still stand at the end of this speech. Then, I want to directly engage because I think this debate is prone to a lot of deadlocks forming. So the first thing I'll do is just straight up weighing. Where is abuse more likely? And this is the first thing I want to do. The first thing is on the likelihood of opt-out, i.e., where is it easier to leave these relationships? OG says this narrative frames loneliness terribly and therefore scares people from leaving. I have three problems with this. One, a belief that it would have been better to have never the narrative that says it would have been better to not love at all. And this is important. Oh my god.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, you get cut off.
Wait.
Yep. Yep.
Damn.
Hello. Okay, wait.
Hello?
Now it's audible.
Yeah, but like I think it's yeah, let's just disconnect from the other devices.
Yeah.
What is me?
I didn't.
How much time? I'm so sorry.
No worries. No worries. In my end, still 2 minutes, and also I think you lost at 2 minutes and 10 seconds, and that the last
Okay.
word that
What was the last thing?
the last word we heard is about the possibility.
Oh, so I was just signposting?
Yep.
Okay. Redoing my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing is on the likelihood of opt-out, i.e., where is it easier to leave these relationships? OG says this narrative frames loneliness terribly and therefore scares people from leaving. I have three problems with this. One, a belief that it would have been better to have never loved at all carries some shame in deciding to finally leave. Because the idea that choosing to leave means admitting that it would have been better to refuse that love, guilting you to staying in order to avoid things like criticism. But also, it's that it is framed as your fault that when you enter a relationship and it fails and you feel hurt, it is your fault that you made a mistake by choosing to enter a relationship in the first place. And this is important, and this is the second problem I have with it. Because there are multiple strategies and there are multiple ways by which society tells you to have a relationship. One, it's the fact that you're biologically primed to feel attraction towards people in the vast majority of instances. Your hormones tell you that you like this person, that they make you feel happy, and therefore you're willing to take a chance with them regardless. Oftentimes, it's in these rose-tinted glasses in the early stage of a relationship that make it all the more likely regardless of what narrative exists. Second, it's capitalist structures that tell you that things like Valentine's and having somebody there is important, regardless of whether or not this narrative is true. So perhaps they don't change anything on their side. Perhaps you'll still be pressured to go into a relationship. The problem is where it's easier to leave it at the point at which it becomes toxic. Insofar as people enter into these relationships regardless, the shame of opting out at the point at which people believe that you shouldn't have opted into it in the first means that you stay. But thirdly, it's an assertion. Why does it frame loneliness as necessarily bad? Often, if it's true that this applies most in instances where people are already in relationships, then oftentimes this doesn't affect people who willingly choose to be single. Or even if people aren't single, there are already existing stratifications within society that tell them that that's okay. Regardless, this affects the people that we talk about most in terms of leaving abuse, meaning that we're already principally prior. Before I go on, OG.
Yeah, but Ines said in setup that it's okay to frame loneliness as bad as part of your policy. So since you argue that, you contradict this and minimize your own benefits.
I don't think you understand the concept of an even if. That is to say, even if this is true, obviously this is what happens in the vast majority of instances. Perhaps loneliness is bad, we're okay with that, but even if it isn't, it's the fact that people don't really care at the point at which they're lonely. That is to say that all of the benefits we get and the benefits that they claim to win on, and they themselves say are important, of ensuring that people in the vast majority of instances are able to opt out of abusive relationships, sway towards our side. The second thing on this, in terms of engagement, is in processing these emotions afterwards. I.e., is it healthier to approach this from a perspective of I want to forget everything that just happened, it's far better for me to have regretted everything, or ensuring and accepting that loss was inevitable in the vast majority of these instances? The first thing that I want to note is that obviously, The pure claim on our side is that it's just so much better in terms of being able to process these things when you're actually able to look back at the relationship objectively. And even Deputy Prime Minister agrees to this when Lorine says that it's important that you look back at it objectively and are able to process it. The problem is that they aren't really doing that under their side. They're merely saying that you regret doing this in the vast majority of instances, which primes you to do things like stay away from it, which means that all of the benefits of potentially learning from a relationship, learning not just more about the person and about it, but more about yourself and your preferences to choose a better relationship in the future becomes stunted. So if it's about choosing a better relationship and processing things like trauma, that obviously becomes better in a world wherein you accept our paradigm. Importantly, what else do they say on this? The first thing they say is, well, the overglorification forces people into relationships early. People want to enter relationships early. There are biological and other societal triggers that tell them to do so. This is uncontested. This is uncomparative. At the very least, we explain why in the instance it goes awry, it gets far better. The second thing they say is that you look and make it feel that you have to enter a relationship. We think that that's uncomparative as well. What you're left with is all of the material we explained to you about how it's so much harder to opt out of things that are abusive, harder to opt out of things that make you unhappy, and harder to opt out of relationship in the instance that it is traumatic. The last thing that we explain is on weighing. That is to say that all of the pieces of loss, that when your father or your mother dies, or when you lose a relationship because that person moves to another country and therefore feel like you have abandoned, we'd say that there is some solvency in believing that there was value to that relationship, that you didn't waste years of your life pining for this person just to have them leave, that you didn't waste years of your life connecting yourself to this person even if you understand that they were going to die at some point. It's in these instances where people who are dealing with grief and the worst aspects of it that they feel this the most, that they're most comforted by narratives that tell them that it is okay to have loved because there's value in that love regardless of the immense pain and the sharp feeling in your chest that tells you that it wasn't, that there was some sort that conditions you to enter into these types of relationships in the future. For all of these reasons, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, DLO, for that fine speech. I invite member of government.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, clear.
Sorry. I'll take POIs via the voice channel. If ever I got out at any point in the speech, kindly just tell me, and I will like pause and restart parts of the speech for us. Okay. Starting the speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. The extension will be simple. Why this worsens the post-breakup life of thousands of individuals. Let's weigh this against the entirety of the bench. Against OG, what they talk about is mostly how you choose relationships better. But the weird thing about this is that it's oftentimes just hard for you to choose any good relationship, regardless of how cautious you are of these things. So one, evolutionarily, your brain often fogs your decision making to do things such as ignore red flags. Because intuitively, it's evolutionarily good if people opt into as many relationships as possible, and thus you're often primed to opt into these things, even if it might seem like a good idea or a bad idea, for the simple reason that your brain itself acts more emotional and more passionate against your better judgment. Secondly, the simple fact that many individuals that do know that they're red flags oftentimes pretend that they're not red flags. Like the simple fact that they're able to pretend towards these things means that's very hard to opt into any good person or any good man to a large extent. But the last thing to point out is that oftentimes the reasons why you break up with people is just structural, right? Like, e.g., a pandemic happens, it destroys the entirety of your mojo, or other structural reasons, such as, for example, them suddenly running out of money and not being able to support you, oftentimes means that all of these factors will still happen. Their margin is still very, very small. So what this debate has to be about mostly is in terms of losing love that is generally inevitable. And we only hear about this in the dying minutes of DPM speech that is simply not enough to make a case. I want to engage really quickly on what OO says. What they say is that there's a tremendous amount of grief that individuals will often feel, and oftentimes it's for things that are outside of romantic relationships. The first thing to point out is that oftentimes it will be about romance, for the simple reason that this is where the narrative itself is often the most applied, right? The simple fact of the matter being that the way that most people talk about relationships and post breakups is the concept that it has been better to have loved than lost. And oftentimes the phrase just isn't used as much parents, for the simple reason that you would have inevitably had to love them all the time, but also because there are simply other coping mechanisms people find more effective in terms of dealing with this loss. Things such as religion, the general concept that those people love you beyond the grave and still have some amount of life in the afterlife. But there's something, and that is uniquely that, the fact that you're able to deal with this in a lot of ways. Like, people in general just intensely empathize lost a relationship with their father, you in general valorize their memory and say that they were a cool person who was really good to have, been your father, those sorts of things. We think that those things are just accessible to people on both sides of the house. And to that extent, this is the most important argument. Why? So what I will point out is that on our side, we will defend it's better to have never loved in these contexts. I want to start with a very simple premise, which is that the vast majority of individuals that just came off of a breakup probably just went through the worst of the worst elements of that breakup. That is, it is during this unique period where they have gone through the worst shit simply because of the fact that it's at that point that these individuals are the most irrational, care the least about each other, and oftentimes the most willing to do intense harms to one another. This obviously leads into immense harms for these individuals. Things such as traumatizing experiences, gaslighting, where oftentimes you become over suspicious of your partner as they cheat on you, immense time loss for the simple reason that you had to spend weeks upon weeks grieving for this person or being with this person when you're intensely sad with them, or even in the worst context, the general concept of sexual assault, sexual harassment with these individuals when shit hits the fan the most, or economic deprivation in some other more desperate cases. There are a few things that happen on their side of the house. The first is that you overemphasize the nostalgic and good parts of the relationship. Why? Because the narrative talks about the lessons, talks about the good things, and the inherent value of those things to a large extent. What are the harms? These things simply, for many individuals, cannot exist alongside how fundamentally these people have harmed you. And to a large extent, you have to push down many of these memories within you for the simple reason that if these two have to exist, you have to admit that this person was either wholly good or wholly bad. And to a large extent, you feel like you genuinely need to hate this individual. And we think that's fundamentally good because it is at this point you probably need to verbalize how this person made you hurt, in what ways this person hurt you to a large extent. And that's for the simple reason that these individuals have a fundamental emotion of rage. And oftentimes that rage must be manifested in diary entries, in expressions of that rage, in the mind, and in how they talk to individuals such as their therapists. And if you do not think of those things, or you push those down to a large extent to be able to think of just the good parts, it's oftentimes intensely hard for you to let those things go, to move on from them by simply saying that again and again and again, and internalizing it to a large extent. The second to point out is that it's often just intensely hard for you to access the OO's narrative. So objectively, it takes a very mature sort of individual to believe in both the possible good things about the person who just harmed you to a large extent and the bad things as existing within the same person. For the simple reason that humans are primed towards aggression or primed towards some extent of hate. Those adrenaline rushes and those emotions which often let people survive within competitive contexts, such as what exists in evolution. And what this all means is that oftentimes individuals on their side fail in their attempt in seeing the good of these individuals. And at that point in time, they feel intense rage, which they feel is not correct, that society tells them is not correct. That means that oftentimes those individuals feel like they're failing in their way of dealing with love and dealing with loss when they're not able to internalize the good that these people were able to do or the lessons that these people were able to give them to a large extent. The last thing is that society writ large invalidates large parts of these individuals. For many individuals, who genuinely just need to be angry, who went through the worst of the worst, society, your friends telling you that there are good parts of the relationship that you should move on by learning about what this person taught you, or just fundamentally harmful because they're never able to let you have that rage within your heart to a large extent. Sure.
Arguably, it's even worse if you only remember the bad parts, because this is when you view the relationship at its most toxic, where it exists as a stain on your record and when it traumatizes you to even think of it, where you don't have an incentive to want to process it in the ways that actually allow you to move on.
But the first thing is, for you to move on, you need to accept that those horrible things happen and that they're creating immensely harmful emotions within you. This is to point out, and this is the fourth structural reason, is that you're never able to actually learn from your mistakes. And this is about extents, right? On our side of the house, what happens is that in the most critical period, where you're internalizing the most lessons post these horrible breakups, etc., you're very intensely willing to be very critical of these people, to know in what ways this love was fundamentally regrettable, fundamentally horrible for you as an individual. And to that extent, these things stay as lifelong lessons for you, to never have this red flag person, to never try and have this sort of relationship where you did not let certain boundaries be respected. And to that extent, there are a few benefits that are able to accrue on our side. The first is that these individuals are able to have their rage and to keep it, to feel like it's a fundamentally valid part of their emotional matrix. The second bit is that they're able to use that rage and to actually use it to learn. Because on their side of the house, they have to valorize these relationships, say that the rage isn't valid, and say that, yes, there were some good things in the relationship. On our side, we are willing to be more cautious, to say that things were objectively bad when they were bad, whereas on their side, they have to valorize these things at least to some extent, because they fight that it's better to have loved, even if it is lost. Propose.
Thank you, member of government, for the fine speech. Now I would like to call upon member of opposition.
Hello, hello, hello. Can I confirm that I am visible and audible?
Yes, okay.
Wonderful. POIs in the chat, please. And just because we've all had a lot of internet issues, in case I do cut out, do unmute yourself and let me know. I don't want anybody missing out on content. Okay, I'll just be starting momentarily. Panel closing opposition intends to take this debate on strategy, because unlike everybody else here, we're not just going to talk to you about how this narrative affects you after you've suffered a loss, whether that be the loss of a relative or a breakup, but about how this narrative affects everybody ever engaging with taking a risk on love. Because this is where, in particular, opening opposition and closing government, although largely opening government as well, have completely missed the debate. They've assumed that the only time you're exposed to this narrative, and therefore the only time this narrative has any impact on you, is after the point that you've actually loved and lost. This is not the case. Many of us have never loved and lost, but we are still exposed to that narrative, which informs the decisions we make when seeking and chasing love. I'm going to show you how everybody has been very disingenuous to that debate so far. This is also important and weighs importantly because everybody at some point, at most points in their life, confronts chasing some sort of love, whether they're very romantic, platonic, or filial. Not everybody is dealing with loss at all times. Loss usually occurs later in life, which means by default, the way that this narrative affects people prior to love is more important than how it affects people after love. Two things inside this speech. Number one, I'm going to talk to you about how the attempt to put yourself out there to find love in and of itself is a good thing and leads to positive impacts in people. And number two, I'm going to lead to you how on average this leads to more loving human relationships, which is a net good. All of my rebuttal and weighing will be integrated across these two issues. So first of all, the attempt to put yourself out there to find love alone leads to good outcomes. You'll notice this has nothing to do with whether or not you're successful. 4 different ways in which this leads to good outcomes. Number one, it leads to personal growth. By virtue of trying to put yourself out for love, you are learning the value of vulnerability. You're learning the value of empathy. You have to know more about yourself so you can understand what it is that you appreciate in another. All of these are also accentuated in the event that you find love, and therefore this is a unique benefit you get simply out of putting yourself out there. Secondly, by virtue of the fact that you want to be successful in love, you are likelier to work on your personality. Therefore, by virtue of the fact that you know that loving and losing is better than never having loved at all, that is to say that even an unsuccessful relationship is better than anything else, you will try your hardest to make sure you can get into those relationships, which means becoming funnier, which means becoming more caring, which means becoming more charming, and therefore a better person on the whole. Number three, it gives you more ambition and it makes you work harder. And I want to note here, the margin here is not you don't want to work a job, do you want to work a job? But people who already want to work a job and get a house, their ambitions are raised by virtue of the fact that they probably eventually want to cohabit with somebody. They want a house, they want a car. This doesn't mean that you develop ambition out of nowhere, but it means all of your ambitions are increased and emboldened in a way that they wouldn't be if you were not thinking and considering love and the impact it has on your life in the future. And fourthly, even in the event that you find love and fail and there's a terrible breakup, so far nobody's mentioned this, you develop more resilience as a personality in the face of loss, heartbreak, and all of those things. And given that they are inevitable, we think it is a good thing that you pick up practice doing this sort of thing. So you'll notice our first extension here is that it's simply the attempt to put yourself out there to find love of itself leads to good outcomes. And this is, we think, a good thing. The second issue then on how this leads to more relationships, which is a net good. And we're going to note over here, we think this does lead to more relationships, which makes us more generous than the opening benches who largely assume that narratives don't seem to actually affect behavior going in. We think they do. And we think that the reason that they do over here is because what this narrative does is it tells you that a life lived without an attempt at love or relationships is worse than a life where you tried. This is important because in many cases, relationships feel risky to start. Openings dismiss this by arguing that, well, it's a biological imperative, so you got to do it, right? I mean, sure, many people will still do it, but the social narrative in favor of taking the risk will impact more people to do it, which means more people put themselves out there, even in the face of rejection, even in the face of the fight or flight instincts which take over them at the moment that they're trying to make themselves vulnerable, which means you're able to get more relationships. Absent this narrative, there is less social pressure to go for these relationships and you get fewer relationships. Before I go on to the issues that other people have had with relationships, let me explain to you what the advantages of love and relationship making are and why those weigh over everything else. Number one, there is simply the basic joys of joy, fulfillment, and partnership, core parts of being a human being. We accept over here, we think, that the historical warrant at this point suggests that romantic, loving relationships add incredible value to human beings. They are frequently things that people care more about in their old age than anything else, more than money, riches, career paths, and all of that. So we think there's a reasonable warrant to claim that the average person finds a deeply human joy inside these relationships, which therefore producing more of which is a natural good. But secondly, we think it also provides practical and obvious benefits in the term of support. In later into your life, you have support. You have somebody with you at any given point in time. Your partner, if you've gone so far as to have children, you're likely to have children. Why are all of these things likely in our world? Because you are trying for relationships more, which means the total number of successful relationships entering society is good rather than bad. The major responses we've had from both government benches here then have to do with bad relationships, people who can't get relationships, and the accumulation of trauma and abuse and situationships. So first of all, let's deal with that final point, right? About how you're likely to pick up a series of traumas and abuses over the course of various situationships. My claim here is that the vast majority, and this, let's also engage with closing government here, who say you're going to overemphasize the good parts of a relationship. My first response to closing government specifically is, in the vast majority of relationships which are not traumatic and toxic, it is perfectly fine to overemphasize the good parts of a relationship because this is arguably healthier and leaves you happier with your life. We think the exception to this is cases where you have genuinely entered situations of trauma development and abuse. And over there, let's engage with both CG and OG at once. CG says your rage will be made illegitimate. We don't think so, because we do not think that the case of this narrative means that you then have to focus on the good parts of truly abusive relationships. Rather, the focus on the benefit of having loved and lost in that case is on the benefit of you having experienced the feeling of love and what that did for you in terms of your self-understanding, in terms of your growth. It is not about loving the person who was abusive to you, and we think that's a ridiculous claim. So we also think that over there, then you actually get more of CG's benefit of working on yourself than you would have otherwise, because by virtue of not on the harm done to you, but on the things that allowed you to, that the things that love allowed you to discover about yourself, you are able to work on yourself in future and identify what is truly good. We also think abusive relationships often have a tendency to be the inverse of this, because they're the ones which you think are safe and stable, and you don't want to risk looking for love and leaving these relationships. We think a world in which love is valorized more is one in which you look for it more. Before I go on, opening.
Yeah, aside from the fact that OG already preempted this, your case is uncomparative because people are still pressured to be able to put themselves in the market, as opposed to our side where people can make decisions because they have better alternatives like being single or being with friends.
I believe OO already told you guys weren't being comparative earlier. I'm sorry to double down on this. This is absolutely comparative because this social narrative pressures more people who otherwise would not have tried to put themselves into the love market, therefore increasing access to all of the benefits love uniquely provides you. Again, put a notice, no government neither government bench has given you reason to believe that the majority of relationships are bad or harmful or anything of that sort. We think, if anything, the majority of people who have encountered romance and tried for romance have actually led to improvements in their life, both by virtue of just attempting it and secondly by virtue of the types of relationships they've had. The final thing I want to deal with here is the idea of ugly people, loners, and people who can't get relationships. My first response, most people can get relationships, especially because other people are also not conventionally attractive and will pair up with you, because some people are open-minded, and because the promulgation of this narrative means you settle and try to find people to fall in love with. Secondly, we think even if you don't find relationships, you're likelier to end up working on yourself, which is still a net good you wouldn't have access in the other world. And finally, if it is genuinely the case that there's a small minority of people who cannot get relationships, I don't see why they're more important than increasing the net utility to humanity through relationship building as a whole. We take this debate because we actually talk about this narrative affecting everybody. On those grounds, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, member of opposition, for the fine speech. Now I would like to call upon Captain
Hi. Okay. Sorry, there's someone debating as well in the same vicinity as me. So just tell me if it gets too loud. But I'll take you guys through chat. And yeah. Sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Love can build and cause feelings of happiness within you. But at the same time, love has caused wars, it has caused trauma, and the inability of people to move on with their lives and become independent beyond these relationships in the very first place. And that's why on government side, there is a need for a good counter narrative against the very pervasive forms of love and the vulnerability that you have as a person when we come with it. And that's why there is also a need to become more objective, which we proved on our side. The first thing I'm going to do is just weigh over OG and tell you why specifically our extension was the most important. I want to note that first, they say that it's important before entering the relationship. I want to note that we proved that they had to implement these benefits. It's quite hard at the end of the day. Things like, for example, you're biologically primed to not be as subjective and be as subjective when you're going through things like love, or you can't necessarily always control your preferences and all of these things. What we provide are two things. The first is just a more tangible benefit. So we tell you that this is more important in the period post breakup. It's applicable to all, for example, that when you're disillusioned, you're irrational, and it's just a more applicable frame as opposed to like the pre-relationships that they have, where you cannot always control the circumstances. At least on our side, we have more autonomy post breakup. But the second is that we cater to the most vulnerable period of the self. So before the relationship happens, you still have some amount of like choice in that manner. But once you've broken up, that's when you feel the greatest emptiness that you have to adapt in order to the daily lives without this individual and prevent from opting into these bad tendencies or vices at the end of the day. And this is starting important because we prove the exclusivity and the prerequisite of objectivity that everyone wants. That can only happen with our mechanism of being able to set boundaries with this specific narrative, spending more time, for example, with other individuals and processing our emotions when you have moved on versus on opposition where you're still hung up, especially with the worst kinds of relationships. The first thing I'm going to do is just frame out CO and why they're not relevant in the debate. The issue with their side is that they operate on a very squirrel kind of debate where they make the debate into relationship good versus relationship bad. I don't think this is very strategic and the burden that this motion calls for. They have two main claims. The first thing that they talk about is the attempt to put out there is generally a good thing. I'm going to disprove all four mechanisms. The first thing they say is on value and vulnerability. This is just not exclusive, right? There are already large mechanisms to be vulnerable. There's a premium on relationships, the same mechanisms as OO, of Valentine's and capitalism, or things like your biological tendencies that make you more vulnerable. The second is just things like working on personality. It's just not true, right? When you have a rose-colored lens, you see your partner as the most funny person, the most prettiest person, the most smart person. So you won't work on your personality because they will always see you as the best. The third, about ambitions being raised, I don't think this is exclusive. You have things like capitalism or parental pressures, especially from Asian parents to pressure you to become even better and have your ambitions raised. But the fourth, in terms of resilience, I think this is just an assertion, right? You give one example, I can give another example, that you won't develop resilience because in these times, you get the most hurt and it's just generally the worst for you. But the second thing they talk about is just better loving relationships and adding value to human beings. But they say that most relationships are traumatic or abusive, thus it's not value in this debate. But even, for example, they are not the most number of relationships. It's the fact that they're the most vulnerable. When you feel the most empty, you aren't able to cope. And that's why we defend it at the end of the day. I'm gonna then deal with OO, right? And this very like out of debate frame that they kind of like disregard the whole debate too, and why they're necessarily out of it as well. I want to note that they talk about things like grief, things like parental love, but note that this is a regrets motion, and it should be how it has manifested in the past and has been propagated. Majority of the times that this narrative has been used was for romantic relationships, not the grief from your mom dying. And this is true for three specific reasons. The first is that they never proved that this was the main mechanism to prove this. Note that they mostly asserted that this is used in love and that's why it's true. The second is that this was mostly propagated in media and romanticizing movies about like romanticizing your first love or things like The One That Got Away, and that's why it's necessarily important. But the third, it's just there's no narrative telling you that you can opt out of love from your parents. These are more for relationships by choice and not blood because you're predisposed to being in it already. But moreover, we prove from Elio quite clearly that there are other narratives like religion, for example, reincarnation, heaven, that allow you to better cope with the grief from your parents, or things like, for example, death, that already mitigates the worst case of opposition, where there are no other alternatives for being able to deal with grief or the loss of a loved one. And we show you that there are other alternatives for being able to do this. But let's engage, right? And let's be more charitable than OG, because I think what OG does is that they merely brush it off and they don't engage with the crux of opposition. I'm going to engage in that and be the first one in this debate, and that's why we weigh over OG as well. Even if in the case where it is about grief and it is about these specific like parental love, etc., I want to note that making people feel like they move on is just not as effective on their side. The first response to this is that it's just not as true. So things like, for example, in the stages of grief, they're never able to reach the acceptance stage on their side because they're always going to be stuck in things like denial. This was quite clear from Elio when he told you that there's a higher barrier to move on if you are hung up about the past. You're only thinking about them. You're being very nostalgic about all of the good things. And this is especially important when it comes to things like grief, where you have to, for example, you have to have the ability to isolate yourself, or you have to have the ability to distance yourself from that amount of grief in order to be able to move on and talk about like the other aspects of your life, to in order to not just like see reality in that specific person's perspective. But even in the best case, right, where that case is quite healthy, and assuming that not conceding that they have healthy coping mechanisms, it likely takes longer for these individuals, that you have to be emotionally mature enough to accept both the bad and the good, or have the mental capacity to reconcile things like grief and help. And I want to note that this is necessarily harmful, because for a lot of people, they are not necessarily the most rational people. I think people like humans are generally like irrational by nature, and thus it's not as applicable to these people. I'll take a PY from OO.
So if you can see that people's first instincts are to be toxic and to be hard on themselves and to see all the bad, then isn't our narrative good because it allows a tempering of both in order to be able to move past it completely?
So there are two cases in which this debate operates. The first is that your case, which is generally like just out of the debate, not as engaged upon. It's just that you have a healthy relationship, right? And that's where I'm talking about why it's not as effective. I'm going to talk about later on like why it's better for more toxic relationships. But the reason why ours is better is we're able to set boundaries, spend time away from fixating on that person to process that relationship in motion. But moreover, it's quicker and more accessible for the general person. But the reason then why I'm also going to engage in the case where it's toxic, for example, is that they say in a POI that it's worse if you look at the worst parts because things like hurt and fixation will likely occur. I want to note that's not true, because in most vulnerable relationships where the individual is like abusive, many people hyperfixated on the good. So this narrative on our side of never to love, have loved of all, is just far better as a counter narrative to that immense rose-colored glass that opposition will likely have. And that's why we have the exclusive balancing mechanism that is only gotten from CG, by the way, which means that you're able to get better formed decisions and be able to have better informed objectivity on our side. Thanks.
I thank the government whip for the flag speech. Now call on opposition's whip.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes, but clear.
All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Dumbledore said, "Don't pity the dead, Harry. Pity the living, and above all, pity those who live without love." This is because living with love has extremely unique and important benefits that none of government bench contend with in this match. But before I weigh that out, notice how closing government's rebuttals are extremely problematic here. They tell you two things. One, they tell you that there's many other ways of achieving the kinds of benefits that op bench is achieving. Yeah, sure, but that's extremely uncomparative, because if you buy and agree that we provide some level of benefits and our mechanisms necessarily tell you that you can get more of those benefits by virtue of our policy, then you necessarily agree that our world has more benefits. The fact that your world also has some benefits doesn't necessarily mean that that's enough of them, right? Like it's a net good to get more of them. If all of Gov bench agrees that the like benefits of pursuing relationships sort of improves your personality, then that means the more stronger that narrative is, the more your personality improves. But the second response they have on this analysis is, listen, you don't need to improve your personality because like you're already with your partner. So like, what's the need? How do you get that partner, bro? Like you get that partner because you worked on your personality and improve yourself, and then you get selected. But secondly, even when you are in a relationship, you are worried about being broken up with, you are worried about being dumped, right? The idea is you want to continue improving because one, you don't don't want to lose the relationship, especially when the narrative like this exists. But be more importantly, even if you don't worry about the breakup, simply just becoming a better person for your partner is more often than not like a goal that people individually have. You want your partner to think you are very smart. You want your partner to think you are very funny. What does GovBench as a whole tell you about this? They say, listen, but love makes you blind, right? You can never be rational about love. And so like you just think your partner's great and you think like everything about the relationship was rose tinted and whatnot. I have three responses to this. One, I'm very unsure why this is true, especially because in this debate, we're talking about like all kinds of love, right? People presumably have developed some kinds of love at every point in their life, either with their parents, with another partner, with someone or the other. The vast majority of people don't become idiots and don't become just unable to figure out or prioritize their life. People very often are in love, but continue to prioritize, let's say, going to work or being with their friends or debating at this tournament rather than being with your girlfriend, because people have the ability to not just think that their partner, just because love is important, is more important than every other thing in every other situation. We think people have the ability to rationalize, given the fact that in their world, the narrative exists and people like me and everyone else continue to live like normal lives. I don't think they've mechanized to you why exactly love just blinds you. What is it about love? The only thing they assert over here, however, is listen, because you've been told that like love is so important, somehow that means you agree that your partner is the only person in the world that you can fall in love with and they're phenomenal as well. Notice, no analysis to prove this, because Taha's speech consistently tells you that this narrative tells you to seek out love, i.e. seek out this feeling of connection and this feeling of positivity and relatability and whatnot. I'm very unsure then why people necessarily are constantly settling in for the worst kind of relationships in their world, especially in a world where they don't feel the kind of love that exists. To this they say, but listen, no, just because the narrative tells you need to look for love, you'll kid yourself into feeling love. I'm very unsure how you manage to do that because of two things. One, there's probably people around you who sort of like tell you you're in abusive relationships and stuff, like help you open your eye, like I'm not sure why this is this iron curtain you are behind where you can't see anything. But two, and more importantly, I'm very unsure why everyone who is going in love is going in these massively abusive relationships. Because notice, by their own analysis, the vast majority of people aren't really like horrible people who are in abusive relationships, who are just abusive, right? There's a lot of people presumably who actually love themselves. Given the fact that the vast majority of people, by their own analysis, are feeling that their relationships are providing them something good, by CG's especially own analysis that this relationship just made you feel really good and you just like really look at the good bits of it, I'm very unsure why people are just blind to the bad bits, right? No analysis to prove that, which then brings me to just like two things that opening government uniquely has. One, what about lonely people, right? A couple of responses over here. First, some heavy mitigation. Like, a lot of people have the ability to find love simply because by virtue of this narrative, given that GovBench agrees everyone's going to look for relationships more and more, it probably means that like people have slightly lower standards, are willing to go out with each other more often than not. If you are ugly, probably there's someone else who is also ugly. Given the narrative is that finding love is important, you probably are more willing to get with each other. Also, like the vast majority of people have other advantages to fall in love. Masud's already told you how there's material advantages of being in a relationship together, probably like things like double incomes, things like just having someone to emotionally support you, things like when you're out at work or when you're going through rough times, someone to back you up, someone to keep you secure. These are all benefits of relationships that they simply refuse to engage with, right? The idea being that there's enough incentives that exist for lonely people to sort of be more accepting to each other. Why does this still mean our narrative is important? Because I don't want them thinking that like, oh, if there's already reasons to go into relationships, why is this narrative important? Because this narrative tells you that even if you fail, it is still worth pursuing it. And this is where closing opposition uniquely tells you the like importance of this narrative, because opening just says this narrative is one amongst many other things that sort of like helps you win. Tell you that this analysis, we tell you that closing opposition uniquely identifies that pre-relationship, when you like sort of worried about whether or not you should pursue love and how it would harm you, is when this narrative uniquely tells you, even if you lose, even if it doesn't come through, you should be going for this. Before I move on, OG.
Yeah, CO's case relies on an insane best case, which still does not respond to the true case of OG. Note that happy people do not buy into this narrative because there's no delta for them, because either way, they will find happiness in relationships. So, CO is out of this debate.
Why would happy people not want to just improve their happiness, get happier and happier? But B, also happiness doesn't necessarily mean that you pursue relationships. You could pursue other forms of happiness. We are telling you that this uniquely helps you pursue this form of happiness, that A, improves your personality, B, sort of helps you ground yourself in terms of the ambitions, etc. you have, C, sort of helps you in the rough times that you are going through. Very vague terminology in terms of why we have the best case and what we're not necessarily engaging with when it comes to OG. But on lonely people, right? Because I want to also answer this. We want to take government bench at their best and accept that some people may just still not find love. We tell you two reasons why they're still uniquely advantageous to just pursue love. One, the fact that you worked on your personality and all of those things means that even if you're not advantaging in terms of like relationships, the fact that you're trying to make yourself more interesting, more funny, more workable with people, more desirable for people, you get advantages in things like jobs, you get advantages in things like just being able to form friends, etc., just being able to do networking, etc., all of those things. These are benefits that we've told you that exist like even beyond the relationship. But two, we've told you like this narrative tells you it's a noble act. Just going around trying to find love is a human good. Trying to find other people to become like compassionate with them, trying to understand their stuff, trying to form those bonds, we think is a net human fulfiller. In a world where risk avoids you, in a world where risk scares you from reaching out to this net positive feeling, we think you are missing out. Why? What are the two big reasons why CO wins this debate? One, we tell you that this narrative isn't just about post breakups, it's about pre-relationships and during relationships as well. Two, we tell you that this narrative isn't just about relationships also. The kinds of personality improvements, etc., you get devoid of success or failure means that you get advantage in other life as well. Abusive relationships are not the majority. Very proud today to oppose.
Thank you, opposition's whip, for the fine speech. This concludes the debate for this round. Congratulations, everyone, for finishing the fourth round today. Since this is a silent round, there is no A, so all of you can just cross the floor virtually and then just go back to the main hall. And yeah, all the best for the breaking announcement. In case you wish for personal feedback or asking for any reasons behind the decisions, you can approach me after the breaking announcements to Discord. Thank you. And for the judges, we can just stay here.
Ross, thank you for
Thanks
the
for the
round.
debate.
Thanks for the round, everyone.